I'm Dr. Cameron McCrodin, optometrist with over 10 years of experience working with eye movement disorders and other problems with how vision functions after head injury. And today we're going to take you through some of the tests, examinations, and even a bit of the therapy strategies that we've used with Miss Adams. One of the first things that we look at is going to be the ability of the eyes to actually change their point of focus, or what's called accommodative facilities. So with accommodative facilities, we're taking the plus and minus lenses, looking at a target to keep it clear, and flipping between. Every time it's clear, you just tell me as soon as it's clear. And we flip between, counting the amount of cycles that happen in a minute, and comparing that to the norms. After we've checked the accommodative facilities, we then want to check vergence facilities with a 12 base out and 3 base in prism bar. This allows us to tell if the eyes are able to accurately converge and diverge appropriate amounts, which is related to a lot of symptoms and functional issues too. So look at the E for me here. Let me know, is it single here? Back to single. So she reports as soon as it's single, and we're also watching for eye movement. We can see her eye appropriately converge and diverge. Now the entire time we want to pay attention to qualitative and quantitative results. So we're doing these things over the course of a minute and making sure that, you know, her measurements are within the norms, but then we also want to see if it's very provoking of symptoms. We also know that things aren't functioning quite as well as they should be. And that's where the qualitative and quantitative aspects are important. Then we move into checking stereopsis with the polarized glasses. Our preference is to use random dot stereopsis because it takes a higher level of stereo to see it. And we actually then will generally time her telling us which one's popping out, top, bottom, left, or right, for plates 1 through 10 on the random dot 3 stereopsis. Sometimes going back to the random dot animals if we need to. That's a great measure of high levels of binocularity, or how well the eyes can work together. It's related to depth perception, but not even just depth perception. If the two eyes don't really superimpose completely accurately and with a high degree of accuracy, you won't be able to see the depth in some of those things. So it's a great way to measure it. Then we move into some of the tracking testing. One of our favorite tracking tests on here, especially because it's just off of paper, is called the King-Devic test. The King-Devic test, as you can see right here, is a series of plates. There's the instructional plate showing the person how to track through with the arrows through the numbers. So we have our patient read those first. Then we move into the plate with the lines between the numbers, so it's easier. There's a line to track across the page. Next, into the plate where there are no lines. There's gaps between the numbers, but the numbers do follow a line. So the patient reads through them as quick as they can, left to right across each line. And the third plate is more difficult, as the lines are closer together in the vertical direction and the gaps are a little bit more sporadic there. And again, measuring how long it takes to get through this. So for Ms. Adams, these scores were below norms when we first saw her. She was close to 24 or 25 seconds to get through each plate. Norms should be closer to between kind of 14 to 17 or 18 seconds on those plates as well. And that's something that's changed over a little bit of time through treatment, but was still last seen to be a little bit below normal too. One of our other favorite tracking tests to do, and which also gives us a bit of a look at binocularity, is what's called the Readalyzer, or in other circles it can be often titled the Visiograph. So the Readalyzer Visiograph is actually set up here. It consists of goggles that actually measure and track eye movement. So what we do here is we have Miss Adams don the goggles that are set up to record. Then we take a story, which she's going to read. She reads the story while the goggles are recording, and she answers 10 yes or no questions about the story after she's read it. What this gives us is, if we have a peek here, what this actually gives us when we look at it is it actually gives us a basically raw data output where we can see what her left eye is doing and what her right eye is doing while she's reading. You can see the left eye, you can see the right eye, and you can see places that the two eyes really don't work well together. So what it should look like, and what we want to see, is two eyes with a lot more stability when someone's reading. You know, left eye and right eye should be doing about the same thing. The other really nice part about this program, apart from just the raw data, is it'll spit back out a profile which shows how many movements per 100 words somebody makes. the regressions or jumps backwards, what their reading speed was, and even how many of the questions they got correct. Because the correct answers on the questions is what tells us whether somebody's read it and understood it, or potentially whether somebody just kind of blitzed through reading it quickly but wasn't able to actually read it. So that gives us a profile there. We can see with Miss Adams, for example, our reading rate was basically just over a third of where it should be. For an adult level there too. And so that's one of the other ways that we measure how the eyes track. And then again, that nice part with the raw data, we can see what they're doing together, and we can see all the places that those eyes are not working together. So this essentially makes up most of the testing that's done before the main part of the examination, a lot of the background info, and what kind of then informs us as we get into the rest of the examination process. The next step of the exam process is the thorough part of the history, in terms of looking at all the areas where visual dysfunction after head injury can lead to symptoms in daily life and/or limitations. So we want to get through the history and discover where these things are happening. Also determine, what might have been happening beforehand, even in smaller amounts. Was there anything pre-existing? And then the time frame for when things really started to be difficult afterwards. Once we're through the thorough history, we can move into the next parts of testing. So we look at things like visual acuity, which are very just kind of baseline to have them there. We'll look at that in terms of with the chart at the end of the room to see how small of a letter we can see, corrected and uncorrected. Then we actually want to take our auto refraction results, which we would have gotten in the other room, and actually do a subjective refraction to then see if there is any prescription needed at distance. Part of the testing as we go through this, though, is we also look at what's called a fused cross cylinder to find out when Miss Adams is focusing up close, are her eyes actually able to focus where they should or not, or does that kind of keep changing, or does it lag behind where things should be focused? Once we've gotten some of that information, and then we confirm some of the convergence ranges in the instrument itself, in the 4-opter, we then actually want to put on a trial frame prescription. So with Miss Adams, we actually mock up a trial frame prescription in here, and with that prescription in place, based on what we found, we go through some testing to basically see how the eyes and the inner ear work together. So looking at what's called dynamic visual acuity, that's where basically looking at a target, shaking the head side to side about 2 cycles per second, and noting, does the target stay clear? Is it easy to stay focused on it? And what are symptoms like while someone does that? So for example, with Miss Adams, when we started this, in that first one, we actually put a small prescription on her, and it looks kind of like this. And as she looked at the target and shook her head, she was able to note right away that basically things were more still, more stable, and less causing of sort of dizziness and a disintegration between the visual and vestibular systems while she was actually doing that. Once we have that in place, we will then actually look at how are things working up close. So the next part of testing with this is we actually figure out what that near prescription was, and we use that near prescription to look at when she looks at a target with something like a fixation disparity measurement. And with the fixation disparity measurement, how this works is that one eye sees one of the lines above the target or below the target, and the other eye sees the other line. So here, as you can see, that side would see the line above the target, that one below, because we want to watch when somebody's focusing on that target. So when she's looking at that target, are her 2 eyes maintaining fixation, or do they slip with each other like we saw on that Readalyzer? And with Miss Adams, we were able to see that each eye was actually slipping, so it wasn't holding good binocular fusion when she was looking at something. So from a classical standpoint, there's no strabismus, the eye's not turning way off, but when she's maintaining fixation or focus, her 2 eyes are constantly doing this with each other. It's like having a car where the tires are out of alignment and the driving performance problems that you get with that, and even fuel economy, it does make everything less fatiguing. So then up close, what we also do is we get our near prescription in check, and then we want to look at it both. Does she notice any differences in symptoms or improvement in abilities when she's reading, or with what we call pattern glare? Now, pattern glare is high contrast black and white horizontal lines that are shown on a phone screen. And it's one of the things where you can show it to somebody and you can measure different responses in the brain with an EEG based that then align with what somebody notices subjectively. So, in people where it's like, oh, that's really bothersome, if you find the right lenses, you put it in front of them, it makes it so the pattern's not as bothersome. You will actually then watch differences on the EEG, which is a study that we have in process too. So with that, with Miss Adams, we found right away with the 2 prescriptions, all of a sudden she could tolerate the stuff up close much better, and reading was much easier for that too. So that's sort of the overall picture of the testing. We will then often look at actually, once we have those things dialed in, we will then often look at balance testing as well. So stand up for me. I'll show you what we usually use capturing this. If it is relevant, we'll often go to a balance on one foot. If you can pick up one foot and just demonstrate, or the other foot, or doing something like a tandem walk where it's one foot in front of the other. That's often seen, and you can just take a few steps forward or backwards, often seen in like roadside sobriety tests. That's what's everyone, you go backwards. That's what everyone's kind of familiar with it for. That's what allows us to determine whether or not somebody's visual function is working the way that it should, or if there are areas of impairment. Then with the history, the timing of onset, and their subjective information and symptoms, we are then able to tell, when did this occur, what was it as a result of, etc., and to kind of build out that entire history around it. Because if somebody shows these types of measurements that Miss Adam has, they will always have very, very similar symptoms to that. So that's one of the ways that you know that it wasn't existing prior to an accident, is if they're symptomatic afterwards and have the objective measurements that back it up, but weren't symptomatic beforehand, then you know that that's likely the probability is that it is a result of the accident, because they didn't have the symptoms before, were able to function fine. Afterwards, we've got objective and subjective changes in function, and then reporting of what they can and can't do. So once we've identified all those things, when it comes down to treatment's a combination of a few things. One, we can often change the glasses and lenses. So there's ways to use prism or the prescription itself that can change how the eyes and the inner ear work together. So one of the things that we did with Miss Adams was we actually gave her a lens that actually meant that when she moved her head, her visual perception of depth and space more closely matched her vestibular information, which meant that the two systems weren't fighting each other. And it also helped to improve her spatial perception there, which brought down a lot of the symptoms that she was getting in some of those areas. We will then often also prescribe different lenses that stabilize the eyes more when somebody's reading or using a computer. And then the vision therapy itself is about activities that help the brain recalibrate how the eyes are actually tracking, how accurate the peripheral awareness is of these things, and how the eyes are working together as well. And a little bit of integration between that and our vestibular system too. So that's the vision therapy that she's undergone as well. We saw a lot of improvement and results in our first course of that. And then since then, we've actually entered into revisiting some of those things, which has now yielded us more improvements in some of those areas as well, which can all be found in the files and measurements and documents there. So that's essentially been the course of treatment with Miss Adams, and the testing that sort of supports those things. Ultimately, again, those important pieces, because it's a combination of both objective and subjective. If somebody walks in with subjective complaints, but there are no objective findings that show where vision isn't working well, then there's nothing to be done from this side of it. But in Miss Adams' case, there were a multitude of objective findings that supported the subjective complaints and differences that she noticed. And on top of that, we've seen results from treating those areas to both improvement to symptoms and to function.